Hello, and welcome to Veronica's Voice, the podcast for cycle breakers and legacy makers, where we keep it real, raw, and authentic. Hello, and welcome to this conversation. I'm so excited to have today Martina Meyer, and she is an advanced grief recovery specialist. So, we're going to be diving into grief today, and especially how it's related to recovering from past painful relationships and narcissistic trauma. Martina is a masterful coach who is deeply committed to inspiring her clients to live their most fully expressed lives filled with love, joy, and happy, healthy relationships. Totally makes sense why we connect, because that's my mission in life as well. So we're here to help you with that. She guides her clients through the grief recovery method, and we're going to talk about what that is. And she does that with an open mind, caring heart, and authentic compassion so that you can liberate yourself from unresolved grief or old painful relationship patterns without going down the rabbit hole of shame, blame, resignation, or fear. She offers her clients a holistic mind-body approach for a full spectrum happy life. So welcome, Martina. So happy to have you here.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So Martina, let's start with one of the things that you shared with me, which I think is amazing, is that the grief recovery process, that you do that in service of the other things that you teach. And so I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about the full spectrum of ways that you support clients and how the grief recovery method fits into that.
Yeah, so some of my backgrounds are, I'm an entrepreneur at heart. And so I teach a lot of leadership courses and how to build new dreams, as well as helping people find new love or, clean up some relationships from the past, from divorce in particular. And I found that when I take people through the grief recovery method first, so that we can see, okay, what's stuck away in the corners that you haven't dealt with yet? What are some of the, beliefs and some of the things that are sitting in the corner that I've never looked at? Then all my other coaching, gets fast tracked.
Amazing.
And for me, the grief recovery method has been the most effective, and it's one of my favorite tools for cleaning up anything that comes up in relationships, any kind of misattunement.
Yeah, that's amazing. And one of the reasons that that we're connected, well, there's a couple reasons, but I suggest for people to reach out to you because in the work that I do supporting people in narcissistic trauma recovery, grief comes up, and oftentimes people are surprised by the grief that's coming up as they're going through this relationship recovery process. And so I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what grief is and how it's misunderstood or why it's misunderstood.
Yeah, and let me start by, one way we look at it is trauma is the event that happens, right? It's the event that overwhelms your nervous system, that doesn't know how to deal with that particular situation. And grief is the leftover emotions, right? And I find that grief is one of the most misconceived experiences in our society. So, number one, grief is actually not a feeling, but the way we look at it is that grief is the conflicting feelings that come up at the end of or change of any familiar pattern. So when you
The
look at,
conflicting feelings.
yeah, the
Conflicting feelings.
conflicting feelings that come up at the end or change of any familiar pattern in life or behavior. So that's a big, big thing, right? That in itself. We
Yeah.
also talk about that grief is the normal and natural human response to loss or change of any kind. And while grief in itself is normal and natural, the coping methods that we are taught often are not normal and not natural and not helpful.
Interesting. Can you say more about that in terms of the coping methods? What do you find is not natural or not helpful about? I guess first question is, what are the coping methods that we're usually taught? And then part two is, why are they not natural or not helpful?
Great question. Yeah. So almost everyone nowadays is familiar with the term the stages of grief. You've probably heard of that, right? That was a term that was coined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it was actually not the stages of grief or grieving, it was the stages of dying. So she found out then that when people were diagnosed with a terminal illness, that they went through, most of them went through consecutive stages, before they reached something like acceptance of their diagnosis. However, it's not a good idea for grievers. To,
Interesting.
there are no stages. Every journey of grief is unique, right? And
Wait, there's no stages?
there are no
That
stages.
feels a little alarming to me. I felt myself go, wait, but I want to know. I want to know what
Yeah,
stages
so
are
the
they if I'm almost
stages
done.
are, it first starts with denial, right? When you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, you're in denial, like, no, that's not happening to me. A lot of people experience that. I have yet to find a griever who actually denies that a bad thing happened in their life, right? They're not in denial that their partner left or died. They're
Martina, can
not
I?
in denial that they lost their job.
Yeah. Can I challenge
They
that a
might
little
be in
bit?
denial of the emotions, but they're not in denial that.
Right. And denial of the emotions. Yeah. I have a, I don't, not so much challenge to that, but maybe clarification. Um, that makes so much sense what you're just saying, that people are not in denial of what they experience, right? They know they lost somebody, or they lost a marriage, or they lost, something that does come up for me in the work that, or for my clients in the work that I do with them is, sometimes they don't, it takes them a minute to understand that it's grief, because they grieve. The grief is something, it's often about something like the future they thought they were going to have. So they're not necessarily grieving like a specific like an event. Like they may be grieving the loss of the marriage or the loss of the relationship, but then also there's other grief that comes up and they don't recognize it as grief. Have you encountered that, or does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so how
So
could
again,
somebody maybe
when you look at that,
recognize?
grief is the normal and natural response to loss or change of any kind, right? Loss and change come in different forms. Every relationship, whether it's to a person, a situation, a home, right, is unique. So even when two people go through a divorce, let's say two people and two kids, every single one of them has a different experience, has different conflicting feelings. They might be relieved that, the narcissistic person is no longer in the home, but also really scared. What now without their income? Or, I don't know what to do now. What if I'm alone forever? Right.
That's a
And
great
so some of,
example.
yeah.
Yeah,
So the way we define grief is, or how you know that you have grief. Again, grief is not a feeling. Grief is a mixed bag of emotions, of sadness and anger and frustration and, relief and maybe joyful moments, or, and then maybe feeling guilty that you felt joy for a moment, which you shouldn't be experiencing in the midst of this chaos. And now what do I do with this? Right. And so one of the things that we look at is like, it's the things that I wish were different, better, or more, right? That addresses the hopes of the future, the expectations I had. And sometimes even in the best of relationships, you didn't even know you had expectations or
that's
hopes
right.
until after it ended, right?
That's
Um,
what happened with me, I think, Martina. Yeah, and I love what you said, and I kind of want to underscore it, is that grief is not an emotion. I'm not sure if I've ever heard anyone else talk about it that way, but that it's a mixture, it's a combination of emotions that's a response to loss or change of any kind. And I think I know when I left my marriage, I experienced that relief you were talking about, because I stayed way too long, and by the time I left, I was like ready to be gone. So I didn't have that immediate grief, which I'm using it as an emotion, which I'm realizing is now incorrect, right?
yeah.
And so then all the emotions kind of snuck up on me because I didn't recognize the emotions around the loss because there was that relief. So it was a strange experience for me.
Yeah. And then grief also is the, unfinished business that we have, the loose ends, right? The undelivered communications, especially of an emotional nature. So it's the things that we either said or didn't say, and we now regret. Or the things that we did say, but we feel they were never heard. Those are the things that are incomplete, right? Incomplete, undelivered emotional communications. And so in the grief recovery method, the first thing that we do is we look at what are some of the myths that we've learned, and they're a little bit different for everyone, but we looked at like 6 core myths that we identified that most of us have learned in one way or another that are not helpful, but we think they are. Like,
Yeah.
like time will heal it. Just give it time, and you'll get over it. And yet, I've talked to people who 20 years later, when you open that door or when something happens, it all comes flooding back as if it happened yesterday. So time doesn't heal anything. We do, right? And
Can you
knowing
share a
that.
little bit about that, Martina? So like, can you bust that myth? Because that's one that comes up a lot. Why does time not heal it? And what could somebody be doing instead to heal it now instead of hoping time will heal it?
So when I assume that time will heal it, I'll just set it aside, right? And I like to use the analogy of a steam kettle. I just put it in there because I don't know how to deal with that. And then something else gets added, something else gets added. And the coping mechanisms that I've learned just bring short-term energy relief, right? Like I'm just blowing off a little bit of steam. And some of those things are food, right? In America, we have a term called comfort food, right? Retail therapy, right? Things that I'm coping that give the illusion that I'm dealing with my feelings, but they're actually not dealing with them, right? Under the myth of it just takes time could be one. Another one could also be, grieve alone, which
Mm,
I think. And those things are sometimes very hidden messages, like, oh, let's not invite her right now. She's grieving. Let's give her some space. Let's give her some time. Well, how do you know that that's what she needs? Right? Or I think I can't talk to anybody about this because I would burden them, so I need to deal with it alone. And it starts very young a lot of times, parents saying to a kid, go up to your room until you stop crying, and then we'll talk again. Right? So the
right.
message that that kid learns is two things. Number one, grieve alone. Nobody's going to help you deal with the feelings. Number two, don't feel bad, and don't feel bad in front of others. Right?
Yeah, don't feel bad in front of others. That's definitely one that was ingrained in me. What are some tips or recommendations you would give to somebody if someone in their life is grieving? So in alignment with what you were just saying, these are the things that we've learned that are not helpful. So I can imagine someone listening is like, well, darn, how do I support somebody who's grieving?
Well, that's why I like the grief recovery method because it's an action-oriented program that actually teaches you the steps, that teaches you, first of all, makes you aware of, oh my God, I had no idea that I've learned this, and I thought there was something wrong with me because I wasn't getting better. Well, for most people, there's nothing wrong with their thinking, there's nothing wrong with their mental processes. Their hearts are broken, right? They need somebody, a soft landing place to help walk that really difficult road from here to here, from your head to your heart, those 14 inches that I've come to believe we're not supposed to walk alone, right? So, for starters, find somebody that's safe, somebody that can hear you, that can witness you without fixing, without saying anything, right? So that you actually get to tell the story. Even if you say, okay, you know what, for the next 20 minutes, can I just vent? Would you be willing to just listen to me? And then when I'm done, don't give advice, don't say anything, just say thank you for sharing and give me a hug. That can already be helpful. Now, that doesn't solve what's in the kettle, right? What solves what's in the kettle would be learning the steps that it takes to complete these undelivered communications. What do I do with that? How do I actually discover what they are? And then complete them one by one so that my heart feels whole again.
That's
And
beautiful.
that's what the method does.
Yeah, yeah, that's really beautiful. And you were talking about, grief getting in the way of other things and how this grief recovery method is often the first thing that you do with clients in support of some of the other things that you do, leadership, and you're also a conscious uncoupling coach. And so you do a variety of things. What are some of the ways that unresolved grief might be preventing somebody, people listening, from moving forward in their life? Like what does it get in the way of?
So for me personally, it got in the way of actually figuring out what a new dream is. I remember after my divorce, people would say, "Oh my God, you're young, attractive, you're financially okay. What are you going to do now?" And I could have punched them because I had no idea. And I was
Mm,
actually afraid to think of it. I had no idea at the time that there was actually the unresolved grief that was keeping me. It was, I was thinking I need to protect myself, right? And some of the ways that I protected myself is, ruminating about things, overthinking things, unresolved grief can also be the things when you avoid talking about somebody or something, or when you are afraid if I start talking about it, I'm never going to stop, right? So it can be very subtle and you don't even notice that you're doing some of these things.
yeah.
But a lot of times it gets in the way of, there's just something like off, right? So the way we look at it is that unresolved grief can, hamper your ability to be happy, your capacity for happiness in life. And a lot of times it's not having been taught the things of what do I do when I lose something, right? Schools and colleges and leadership programs, they teach us how to build things, how to
Yes.
acquire things, but they don't teach us what to do when we lose them or when they change. And that's a piece when you catch up on that and you now have a tool, right? How do I complete something rather than looking for closure, as we call it in pop culture, right? When I
Yes,
talk
looking for
about
closure.
feelings or when I close the kettle, the stuff's still there. When I have learn the art of completing these things, they're no longer there.
The art of completing. I love the way you said that. So, would you say that closure is one of the myths? When you were talking about myths earlier about how you're supposed to cope,
Yeah,
do you consider closure to be a myth
yeah,
in that sense?
yeah.
Yeah,
It just doesn't work. So you could call it a myth.
yeah. It
Yeah.
doesn't work, and what actually works is the art of completion. What
Yes.
what what kinds of things does the art of completion require?
So basically, in the grief recovery method, we do an in-depth review, first of all of the losses that you've ever experienced, which is an interesting exercise, to have a look at. And then we complete one relationship at a time. So we look at all the things that have been left unfinished. A lot of times we just stuff them away. We don't even think about them, but they keep coming up. And they keep coming up in other relationships, right? They have roots all the way through us. So when we can follow those roots and actually complete them, go all the way down and change it, then they're no longer there. We make new sense of even of who we are, right? In
Yes.
my own case, I found the grief recovery method actually 24 years ago after my dad ended his life by suicide. And at the time we were estranged. I had actually moved out on my 18th birthday. He was a diagnosed narcissist, diagnosed bipolar disorder. So there were a lot of things not normal in my upbringing, which I didn't know for many years afterwards. Like, oh, what? That's not normal. And so the interesting thing is, after he died and I found the grief recovery method, not only did it help me make sense of this really ugly situation of the suicide and everything, all the emotions that came up around that, and the guilt and the ideas of could I have done something different and am I really at fault of this? Um, but it also changed my view, of wishing for a different yesterday, for a different childhood, for a different dad. And that was something I wasn't expecting. So, I use the story of my dad with all of my clients now. So in a way, my dad has become a powerful teacher, co-teacher of the grief recovery method. And
Wow,
I
that
would have
gave me
never
chills.
thought, yeah, I would have never thought that that was would be the case.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. I know a lot of people listening can really relate to that. And certainly I can in terms of the wishing for a different childhood, wishing for a different parent. How could my life have been different if I'd had a different parent? And wow, I can feel it even as I'm saying it now that again, I'm using grief as an emotion. And so now I'm needing to correct myself, but I can feel that kind of constriction around there's still some, there's pain around that. And I know a lot of people who've experienced narcissistic trauma have had experiences in their early childhood where they wish they had a different parent. They wish they'd had a different childhood.
Yeah, and
Um,
so ultimately what I help people is find a tool and develop it or learn the action steps that it takes to say goodbye to that pain so
yeah,
that the good memories can surface again, that they're no longer clouded by grief. Grief meaning conflicting feelings about it. I wish I could enjoy this idea, that memory of my dad buying this birthday present, but the bastard did so many bad things, so I don't even want to think about that. And so
yeah,
now I'm going to withhold love from anybody who, just does something very subtly similar to my dad out of my self-protection. And what if I can say goodbye to some of these pains? Not to the memory, not to the relationship. Our emotional relationships continue, right? To the people that have affected our lives. But the cool thing is we can change how we relate to them emotionally by
that's
complete
amazing.
unfinished business that keeps us from freeing ourselves, from saying goodbye to the pain. Because what I also see sometimes is that, and I've been there myself, that I held on to the pain because the pain is better, or feels if in the survival situation, it's better to have the pain than to have nothing.
Mm,
Right? Catherine Woodward Thomas says, sometimes relationships go from soul mate to soul hate because the idea of a complete rupture is just, such an existential angst that bad feelings and pain are better than nothing. And so
right.
what can complete the pain to allow myself to redefine a new emotional relationship, which is especially important if you are divorcing a narcissist and now you have to co-parent, right?
Absolutely.
I just gotta, it feels like a snowball, like, oh my God, what do I do? But what if you can internally resolve this, resolve your own emotional conflicting feelings around this and have tools even for future interactions that might bring up new conflicting feelings.
That's
What if,
huge. That's huge. And you're talking about really big things here. And I think a lot of times, at least for me, when I've thought about grief, it's what we started with, like the loss of something, the grief over divorce, the grief over death. But now here we are talking about, your experience around healing the relationship with your dad for yourself, healing that experience and your childhood memories and co-parenting with a narcissist or a toxic person. These are really big things that I think many people wouldn't necessarily consider when talking about healing unresolved grief. And so I'm curious if you have found that people misdiagnose or call grief something else or try to look for different solutions that are incorrect. If you could speak to that.
well, depression sometimes. Right. And we're back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. That's one of the so-called stages of grief. Not everybody gets depressed after a loss, right? But sometimes we feel sad, we feel frustrated, we don't want to get out of bed. We experience the physiological side of loss, what loss does, what trauma does to us. And doctors often are prone to diagnose depression, insomnia, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD. And yes, they are all diagnoses in their own right. Sometimes the underlying roots can be conflicting feelings that go way, way back, right? So I've worked at times with therapists where I address the grief piece. And at times it changed the therapy afterwards for the therapist and even the medication protocol, right? Not always, right? There are chemical depression, there are, other factors, but sometimes it's misdiagnosed. I think I told you before we got on the recording, one of my friends at the funeral of her loved one said to me when I asked her, "How are you doing?" She said, "Well, I'm medicated, so I'm doing good today."
I'm
Right?
medicated.
I'm medicated, so I'm doing good today, right? And that's one of those things when all we have is these myths, right? Don't feel bad. Replace the loss. Oh, you're young enough. There are other fish in the sea, right? Oh, it'll just take time. Next year it's going to be completely different. And oh, you have to be strong now for the kids, right? All intellectually very sound advice, but not helpful to the broken heart.
Not
It does
helpful to the
not
broken heart.
actually change the feelings. It doesn't acknowledge that I feel sad or frustrated or, scared out of my wits of what comes next, and also relieved that the bastard is gone. Right? Who do I
Exactly.
tell that? Like, oh my God, the father of my kids is gone now, but I'm so relieved. And who do I tell that? And I might be afraid of judgment. I might feel guilty. My kids are now growing up without a dad. What am I doing to them? I mean, that mixed bag of emotions, the pattern just changed, right? So I'm feeling all kinds of emotions. That experience is grief.
Yes. And I love what you just shared, that you've worked with therapists and to support people who are depressed, because I stumbled upon this by accident as somebody who experienced depression most of my life. And then my depression, my diagnosis of depression resolved magically, not magically, from doing the emotional internal work. And when I healed all these unresolved emotions, or healed, I mean, allowed them just to be present, allowed them to come to the surface, acknowledge that my childhood was X, Y, and Z. Oh, wow, my depression goes away. So now it breaks my heart when I hear people say I'm diagnosed with depression. It's like you said, I love that you said it so beautifully. Their diagnosis in their own right. And also, let's look at the root cause. And maybe the root cause is mixed emotions that can be processed, healed, shifted, integrated, etc. And you no longer have to experience depression.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And a lot of those diagnoses, the underlying questions, I wish this was different, better, more.
that's right.
And that's another definition of grief from our perspective. So there are
Yes.
good news in all of this is there are solutions, right? And like you said, when you bring these things, when you presence them in the presence of somebody who can hold this with you, where you don't have to do it alone, because grief alone is one of the myths, but when it comes to light and it's touched by another human heart and you're witnessed in your full vulnerability, there is something about that that moves us through some of these things. And then when you combine that with actually having a process and some steps that I can learn and repeat on my own, right? Because people come for it's an educational program. It's not like therapy where we do this over years. It's an 8-week program and you've learned the basic tools. Some people want to process other relationships with me and stay a little bit longer, or we work on other things, but you can learn this in 8 weeks.
In 8 weeks.
Eight
Wow.
weeks.
That's huge. Can you
Yeah.
imagine someone really struggling with depression, or all these things that we've been talking about, the
Yeah.
early childhood problems, toxic exes, co-parenting, and you can really get to resolution around your feelings, around all your conflicting feelings. And I gotta say, Martina, even though we've spoken before and I'm familiar with your work, I feel like my mind kind of exploded today, because I don't know that I ever really truly understood in my system this concept that you shared today, that grief is not an emotion. It's a complex bag of feelings around change and loss. So that whole concept is just amazing. And I know you have a free gift for our listeners. Can you share? You just were talking about hope and processes, and your free gift starts
Yeah.
some of that.
Yes, and I have two for you. So one
Oh,
is
amazing. Bonus.
yes, so one is an ebook that actually gives some bite-sized information of what grief is and isn't. So it gives a little bit more context building on our conversation. It touches on some of the myths, it touches on some of those things like, oh my God, I had no idea, right? And then what I've created recently, so I have it available as a PDF, is a self-assessment to figure out, do I have unresolved grief? Because a lot of people that are just coasting along, well, the divorce is a long time ago. I'm still, oh, I don't know about dating. I feel this low-grade depression. I just feel, continuously stuck, but I don't know on what. Maybe it's unresolved grief. And so I created a brief self-assessment tool to see, is that what's going on with me? And if
Yeah,
so,
that's
yes,
amazing.
there's help. Yes, there is
So
help.
helpful. So helpful. Sometimes having that clarity of what is happening for me is the first step to really making meaningful change. So for you listening, if you're interested in either one of those free gifts, there's a link in the notes. If you found this conversation on YouTube, it's in the description there, the links for both of those. And if you've received this through an email, the links are in your email. So either way, you have those free gifts from Martina, so you can start processing, understanding grief and processing it and moving forward, most important. So Martina, do you have any final tips or word of wisdom? What do you want people listening to just really walk away with today?
So if this, dear listener, if this touched you, and if you think, oh my God, me too, I might have some unresolved grief, reach out, reach out. The only regret that people have had at the end of the grief recovery method is usually, why didn't I do that sooner? So don't wait. It's not a weakness to reach out, it's a strength, right? And the reason that you are here today listening to this is not because there's something broken, right? Your heart is broken. The reason that you're here today is because part of you wants to move forward. So the good news is you can learn how to do that.
That is such a beautiful message, Martina. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to end right there because I want you listening to really feel those words that you just shared. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me on Veronica's Voice. If you took something away from today's episode, remember to like, share, and subscribe so others can benefit as well. See you next time.